When it comes to knowing what a performance car is going to be like to live with, both good and bad, there is no substitute to talking to someone who's actually done it. So with that in mind, I want to turn my attention to the Evo that I had last year, an Evo VII in particular, which of course you'll see in this video, and it's a car which I've already reviewed here on the channel in Beards and Cars, but in this video I want to give you a different angle, a different perspective. The 4 best and the 4 worst things from my time of owning the car, and then you can use that as an informed decision on whether or not it seems to be the right car for you. And I will say, unlike most of the other cars that I've owned, almost all of them in fact, this is a car which 99% of people will purchase with every intention of modifying it. So if you do plan on doing that, modifying it to some 500, 600, 700 horsepower level, using it for competition or rally, or exclusively using it as some kind of track day toy, then much of what I say probably won't matter as much to you anyway. This is more so for people who either plan to have it as a daily driver, in some cases, or, as in my case, have it as a toy. A second car for a bit of fun. So in my case I had a Golf R32 as my daily, and then the Evo VII for something a bit different. Ultimately it wasn't for me, didn't suit my vibe. It's one of those cars that you've got to really push hard to get the best out of it. So although I'm glad I owned it, it just didn't really suit me. With that in mind though, these are the 4 best and the 4 worst things from my time with an Evo VII. First off then, in the positives, and we're going to jump back and forth between good and bad, this is one which should not be discounted, and it's an easy one to take for granted, and that is the respect factor, the cool factor. Just putting happiness into other people by seeing this car around. There's something about seeing a cool car on the road that makes people from 7 to 70 just look at it, think it's cool, have a grin on their face, give you the thumbs up, and an Evo is a prime example of that. Whether you grew up playing Gran Turismo, watching Fast and Furious, playing Need for Speed, or just enjoying cars in general, an Evo immediately catches your eye, because at least in the UK, you don't see that many of them around. To jump over to the first negative though, this one is fairly obvious. It's one that you've definitely heard before if you've done any kind of research on the Evo, and this applies not only to a 7, but to pretty much any other example, maybe not so much the 10, but probably everything before that, the fuel. Now, when I say that the fuel is bad, it does depend on how you tune it and how you drive it, of course. But the problem that I found with the Evo wasn't so much that the fuel was just bad, which it is. It's more that the fuel tank is tiny on this car. In fact, as I mentioned, I had it at the same time as a Golf, and even the Golf R32's tank is 2 gallons bigger. At about 12 gallons, my Evo only had about a 10-gallon tank. Somehow that 2-litre 270 horsepower engine could quite easily dip below 20 to the gallon, in fact as low as 17 sometimes, and I wasn't even driving it in a crazy way. So that alone you might be okay with. The problem is that on top of that the tank is tiny. So you're in the petrol station every 5 minutes. For some people you might not care, but for me it ended up being quite annoying. So definitely one of the biggest negatives, and definitely one of the most reoccurring negatives as well, because it's that constant thing where you're seeing this fuel gauge just drop like a stone. To go back to the positives though, the next one is again super obvious, but I definitely have to point it out because it's absolutely true: the cornering. Not just handling, but I'm talking grip, I'm talking steering, and more than all else, I'm talking confidence. When you push an Evo hard, it is incredibly rewarding. Completely neutral, completely planted, feels like a rally car for the road because it's exactly what it is, and it is phenomenal. The problem is though, and I've mentioned this to other people, the Evo is kind of like talking to someone at a party who is an Olympic tier diver. But that's it. There is nothing else to their personality. So you talk about their accomplishments, their achievements, and what they're good at for 5 minutes, and now they've got nothing else to talk about. That's really what living with an Evo feels like. And in many ways, I would say that you can experience everything that's great about an Evo in a 20-minute drive. You actually don't need to own one to get the best out of it. In fact, owning one is a good way to start to see the things that aren't so good about the Evo. But that's by the by, and it still goes without saying that the cornering is absolutely incredible. I think for many people the cornering is probably the #1 best thing about the car. To go back to the negatives though, and I kind of mentioned a bit of the negative in there as well, but to go more negative in a specific way, the ride. Now the ride is a weird one, because I've heard people really criticise the Evo for this, saying, oh, it feels like it rides on bricks. You know, again, compared to the Subaru, it's more uncomfortable. That may well be, as I said, I don't know. For me, it's a weird one though, because I never found it to be uncomfortable. I just don't find it to be comfortable either. And I know that's not very helpful to say, but it's really hard to describe. At least for me, the Evo 7, and mine was a GTA as well, which has the Porsche Tiptronic gearbox. It's one of the rarest versions they made. That car, and I'm presuming the manual as well, it's a very strange one for me, because the seats are fairly comfortable. The ride quality overall I wouldn't say is uncomfortable. It just has very hard suspension because it's a motorsport-derived car. So it bounces around a lot, and you feel every imperfection, every pothole, every bump in the road. And it's not so much that it makes you feel uncomfortable, it's just that the car really bounces around a lot. Kind of like what you'd expect from something more like a Lotus, maybe like a Lotus Elise or an Ariel Atom or a Caterham, more that kind of vibe. But yeah, I don't think many people will care, because you can't expect that with an Evo. But again, for some people, it's something that you'll want to bear in mind. Jumping back over to the good points though, this is one which is easy to underestimate, but I actually think it's a really good positive thing. The space. Say what you will about the fuel economy, but the space on an Evo is fantastic. The headroom is really good, even for a taller driver. Legroom, width room is all fantastic, even though it's not that big of a car. The space is great. Not only in the front, the rear seats are great, the headroom in the back is great, and even the luggage room in the boot is really, really good. So even though the fuel economy and the ride aren't that conducive to a daily driver, if you don't care about the fuel and you don't care about the ride, let's say you have kids or just need to take 5 people in the car with luggage, it can absolutely do that. The space is really, really good, and I don't hear people talking about that much, but it really is a genuinely useful car in terms of practicality and space. To jump over to the negatives again though, this might be one that applies more to one like mine, with that Tiptronic GTA gearbox, but I think this probably still applies to at least some of the manual versions as well, at least before modification, and that is the turbo lag has not aged well. And again, like I said, if you tune it up to 400-500 horses, or put anti-lag on or whatever, I'm sure you can get around a lot of those issues. In fact, you can, but at least in a relatively stock one like mine, you definitely notice it. And to put this into perspective of how much you notice the lag, even in the case of my GTA, which they fitted with a slightly smaller turbo specifically to counter the lag so that it would spool up quicker, if I launched the Evo from say 2,500-3,000 RPM, I actually got it to hit 60 miles an hour in a GPS verified 5 seconds dead. That is damn impressive. For a 20-year-old 270 horsepower car to hit 60 miles an hour in 5 seconds is really good. That's quicker than my Quattroporte. However, if you launch it from idle, it's 6.5 to 7 seconds. So talk about lag, that is a massive amount of lag. And the problem is, although you could say, well, just launch it, there are 2 problems with that. One, you don't always have the chance to launch it, so if you try and say race some modern hot hatch, you might be surprised and go home with your tail between your legs on more occasions than you'd care to admit. But secondly, it's not good for your gearbox, especially in the case of the GTA with that Tiptronic, to be constantly launching it. It's not something you want to be doing that often. So it's definitely an issue to bear in mind. Again, like I said at the start of the video, if you do plan to tune it, it won't be as much of a problem, but if you plan to leave it stock, it very well could be. Now though, to jump back over to the positives, our final positive of the 4 before we get to the last negative, the all-weather control and the all-weather feeling of being safe that this car gives you. The Evo is one of those cars, funnily enough, very much so like a Bentley, a Continental specifically, either a GT or a Flying Spur. It's a car that just gives you an incredible feeling of confidence. It feels like the car is in complete control at all times. And if you do plan to use the car all year round, well, that's great. It means you've got loads of grip, even in the rain, the snow, and I'm not saying the car cannot lose control. Of course, if you push it to its limit, it's going to, and any car can slide on black ice. But still, the majority of the time, it is way, way better and way more sure-footed than the vast majority of other performance cars, in some cases, even other all-wheel drive or four-wheel drive. performance cars. And again, that's not surprising at all. It's literally a rally car, so of course it's good. The last negative though is another one which some people won't view as that important, but I want to mention it anyway because it's one of those smaller things that you notice more after owning it for a time rather than just driving one for 20-30 minutes. And this one, funnily enough, actually loops back to the first positive thing, but this is the flip side to the coin, and that is negative attention. Now, what I would say is negative attention, many people probably would find funny, but I really found it tiresome, and I had the same problem in my Golf R32, although to a lesser degree. And that is kids in their loud Corsas, loud Clios, loud Puntos, loud fill in the blank, trying to show you how cool they are. Not necessarily even challenging you to a race, but just revving the nuts off of their car in their little 1.2 active whatever, just blaring it down the street next to you when you're doing nothing, just waiting at the lights. I get what they're doing, I know why they're doing it, I know I should take it as a compliment, and many people probably would or just laugh at it, but for me it got very tiresome. And it's one of the things I love as well about the Lincoln. With a straight piped 7.6 litre, nobody's trying to out-rev you. So I don't even have to think about that anymore. For me though, it is something which kind of annoyed me over time, so it's something that's worth mentioning. This is a car which needs to be pushed hard. It falls into exactly the same category as a Honda Type R. Might sound like an obvious thing to say, you have to push this car hard to get the best out of it. If you're not going to drive it like that, it will bore you. There is no two ways of saying it, because at normal speeds, much like a Civic Type R, there's nothing special about it. It doesn't make a nice noise, it's not particularly quick, the lag doesn't help. So you really do have to push this thing hard to justify the fuel, to justify the performance, and to feel like you're really getting your money's worth. I'm saying that that's not a negative thing because I'm well aware that not everyone drives like me. Many people do love to push their cars hard all the time, so for you, if you are that kind of person, absolutely go for it. Ultimately though, that's it for my thoughts on owning an Evo. For me, I have never regretted getting rid of mine, certainly not because I replaced it with the Lincoln, which I absolutely love and is much more my kind of thing, but I'm still glad that I had an Evo, much in the same way that I'm glad I had a Bentley, as badly as that turned out. And ultimately, of course, if you want to check out other content that I've done about the Evo, you can find that here on the channel as well. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.